In the frozen wastelands beyond the Jordan, a man named Jesus endures 40 days and nights of absolute isolation, where frigid winds tear across barren plateaus, and the line between physical deprivation and spiritual warfare blurs into something terrifying. Haunted by a presence that seems to manifest in the howling storms and the silence between his own thoughts, he confronts not only the brutal reality of surviving without food in a landscape stripped to mineral austerity, but also the insidious voice that offers escape from suffering through compromise. This is survival measured not in sustenance found or shelter built, but in the integrity maintained when every human weakness is exploited, every doubt amplified, and every moment of vulnerability becomes an invitation to surrender what cannot be reclaimed. The wilderness east of the Jordan River stretches in all directions like a vast geological wound, a place where the earth itself seems to have given up on the possibility of life. Here, in the late winter months, the landscape transforms into something unexpected by those who imagine all deserts as scorching wastelands. The Judean wilderness becomes a realm of bitter cold, where nighttime temperatures plunge below freezing, and the wind carries ice crystals that sting exposed skin like needles. It is into this desolation that a man walks alone, deliberately, leaving behind the waters where he was baptized and the crowds who witnessed that moment, seeking something in the emptiness that civilization cannot provide. His name is Jesus, and he has come to this place not by accident or misfortune, but by intention, driven by something he cannot fully articulate even to himself. A compulsion to face whatever waits in the absolute absence of comfort or company. The terrain is unforgiving in its monotony. Limestone hills eroded into fantastic shapes by millennia of wind and occasional rain, wadis cutting through the landscape like scars, and a palette reduced to variations of gray and brown in the pale blue of a sky so vast it seems to press down with physical weight. Vegetation exists only in defiant scattered patches, thorny shrubs that look more dead than alive, the occasional stunted acacia clinging to existence in a depression where water might collect once or twice a year, and dried grasses brittle as old parchment. And this is a place that offers nothing freely, where survival requires constant negotiation with scarcity, and where the silence becomes so profound that a man begins to hear things that may or may not exist outside his own consciousness. Jesus carries almost nothing: a simple robe, a cloak for the nights, sandals already showing the wear of the rocky terrain. No food, no waterskin beyond what he drank before entering this place. The decision to fast is deliberate, a spiritual discipline practiced by prophets and seekers throughout the history of his people. But the physical reality of it begins to assert itself within the first days. The human body, denied caloric intake, begins a sequence of metabolic adaptations. Glycogen stores in the liver and muscles are depleted within 24 hours, forcing the system to begin breaking down fat reserves for energy, producing ketones that alter brain chemistry in ways both clarifying and disorienting. By the third day, the hunger that initially gnawed at his belly with urgent insistence begins to transform into something different, a hollowness that seems to expand beyond the merely physical, creating a lightness in his head and a strange sharpening of certain perceptions, while others grow dim. The cold is immediate and vicious when the sun descends, and Jesus learns quickly what desert travelers have always known, that the same lack of cloud cover that allows daytime temperatures to climb also permits nighttime heat to radiate into space with frightening efficiency. He gathers whatever combustible material he can find: dried camel dung left by passing caravans, dead wood from thorny bushes, twisted roots exposed by erosion, and builds small fires that provide more psychological comfort than actual warmth. He wraps himself in his cloak and presses against stone faces that retain some of the day's heat, creating microclimates of relative warmth in a landscape where hypothermia is as real a threat as any predator. The nights stretch with excruciating slowness, each hour marked by the wheeling of stars overhead, constellations that have guided travelers and troubled sleepers since humans first looked upward and tried to find meaning in the patterns. Water becomes an obsession by the end of the first week, a need that overrides even hunger in its urgency. Jesus moves through the wadis at dawn, searching for seeps and springs, finding occasionally a rock pool with a few inches of water, sometimes brackish and mineral-heavy but drinkable nonetheless. He learns to recognize the signs: darker stone indicating moisture, the presence of certain insects, the flight patterns of birds in the evening. The act of finding water and drinking becomes ceremonial in its intensity, each swallow a conscious acknowledgement of dependency, of the body's non-negotiable requirements, of the thin margin between life and death in such places. His lips crack and bleed in the dry air. His tongue swells slightly. His urine becomes dark and concentrated, all physiological indicators of a body under stress, managing resources with increasing desperation. But it is not the physical challenges that define this ordeal. It is something else, something harder to quantify or describe in purely material terms. Jesus begins to sense a presence in the wilderness, not constant but recurring, appearing in moments of particular vulnerability or doubt. Whether this presence is external or internal, whether it manifests in the physical world or only in his increasingly altered consciousness, becomes a question without clear answer. He hears a voice, sometimes seeming to come from behind him, sometimes from within his own thoughts, a voice that speaks with intimate knowledge of his weaknesses and fears, that seems to understand exactly which doubts to amplify and which desires to exploit. The first temptation comes when hunger has reduced his physical strength to its lowest ebb, when the metabolic process of ketosis has been ongoing for weeks, and his body has begun the grim work of catabolizing its own muscle tissue for protein. He sits among scattered stones, thousands of them rounded and smooth, limestone rocks weathered into shapes that, in his depleted state, begin to resemble loaves of bread. The voice, whether demonic presence or the desperate pleading of his own survival instinct, suggests the obvious. If he possesses the power he suspects, if he is truly what he believes himself to be, then transforming these stones into bread would be trivial, a small miracle to preserve his life and end his suffering. The logic is seductive in its simplicity. What purpose does it serve to die here alone, to waste potential on a gesture of deprivation that no one will witness or understand? Survival is not weakness, it is wisdom. Why suffer unnecessarily when relief is within reach? Jesus remains among the stones, trembling with cold and hunger and something deeper than either, wrestling with the question beneath the question. The temptation is not really about bread, it is about the terms of his mission, about whether his path will be one of using power for self-preservation and comfort, or whether there is a different way entirely, a harder way that refuses the shortcut, even when the shortcut is available and seemingly rational. He speaks aloud into the wilderness, his voice hoarse and cracked, quoting words from the ancient texts. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. The stones remain stones, his hunger remains. But something has been decided, some internal commitment made, that will shape everything that follows. The days blur together in a haze of cold nights and brutal sun, of thirst partially slaked and hunger never satisfied, of walking without clear destination through a landscape that offers no variation and therefore no sense of progress. Jesus climbs to high places, rocky outcroppings that provide vantage points over the vast emptiness, and it is in one of these elevated positions that the second confrontation occurs. The presence returns, and this time the temptation is more subtle, clothed in religious language and scriptural quotation. The voice suggests a demonstration. If God truly cares for him, if divine protection is real and not merely comforting fiction, then surely he could throw himself from this height and be preserved, held by angelic intervention as the Psalms promise. It would be a confirmation, an end to doubt, a proof that would make faith unnecessary because knowledge would replace it. The wind howls across the plateau, and Jesus sways slightly, weakened by weeks without food, his body a collection of aches and depletions, his mind simultaneously sharp and foggy from the neurological effects of prolonged fasting. The temptation whispers through his consciousness, not the crude suggestion to test God's care, but something more insidious, the desire for certainty, for evidence that would eliminate the terrible burden of trust. Faith requires living with ambiguity, with the possibility that one might be wrong, that the convictions that give life meaning might be elaborate self-deception. How much easier it would be to know, to have dramatic confirmation that eliminates doubt and fear. But Jesus recognizes this too as a temptation, another invitation to a shortcut that would fundamentally alter the nature of his relationship to the divine and to his own mission. He answers again with ancient words, "You shall not put the Lord your God to the test." He steps back from the edge. The certainty he craves does not arrive. The ambiguity remains. Time becomes increasingly difficult to track. The succession of cold nights and harsh days blend into a continuum of endurance, where consciousness itself seems to thin and waver. Jesus experiences what extreme fasters and survival situations eventually produce. Altered states where the boundary between waking and dreaming grows permeable, where visions arrive with hallucinatory intensity, and where the mind stripped of regular sensory input begins generating its own experiences. In one of these states, he finds himself, or perceives himself, or dreams himself, standing on a high mountain. But whether he has physically traveled or this occurs entirely in his consciousness is impossible to determine. From this vantage, he sees or envisions the kingdoms of the world laid out before him, all the centers of power and beauty and human achievement, all the glittering prizes that ambition pursues. The presence that has haunted his wilderness sojourn speaks with particular intensity now, offering what seems to be the ultimate negotiation. All of this, all the kingdoms and their glory, all the power to reshape human society and eliminate suffering and establish justice could be his through a simple act of compromise. One moment of worship directed toward the wrong source, one acknowledgement of power through domination rather than sacrifice, and the tools to remake the world would be available. The temptation is sophisticated because it does not appeal to selfishness alone, but to the genuine desire to help, to fix what is broken, to use power for good. Surely the ends would justify such a small compromise of means? Surely results matter more than abstract purity about the source of power? Jesus, emaciated and exhausted, his body pushed to the absolute limits of what human physiology can endure without permanent damage, faces the deepest question of his mission. What kind of kingdom will he pursue, and by what methods? The voice offering immediate power and influence represents everything he could accomplish through conventional means, through the accumulation of political and military force, through the structures that humanity has always used to organize itself and pursue its goals. But he sees with the clarity that sometimes comes only through extreme deprivation that this path, however effective it might appear, would corrupt the very thing he seeks to establish. Some victories are actually defeats because they require becoming the thing you sought to oppose. He responds with finality. Worship the Lord your God and serve only him. The vision fractures and dissolves. He is alone again in the wilderness. The kingdoms vanished like morning mist, return to the brutal simplicity of cold stone and empty sky. The 40th day arrives, though Jesus himself has lost precise count, marking time only by the rough succession of light and darkness, of thirst and partial relief, of cold and brief warming. His body has entered the stage that extreme fasting produces when all fat reserves are exhausted and protein catabolism accelerates. True starvation, where the heart muscle itself begins to be consumed, where organ function starts to falter, where death becomes imminent rather than merely possible. He lies in the shade of an overhanging rock, too weak to gather firewood or search for water, hovering in a twilight state between consciousness and unconsciousness, his breathing shallow and his heartbeat irregular. The temptations have passed, or perhaps he is simply too depleted for the presence to bother continuing its assault. He has survived 40 days without food in one of the most hostile environments imaginable, has confronted questions that have no easy answers, and has emerged with his essential commitments intact, though his body is nearly destroyed. It is in this extremity that something shifts, though exactly what occurs is difficult to articulate in purely physical terms. Later accounts will speak of angels ministering to him, of supernatural assistance arriving at the moment of greatest need, but the experience itself resists simple categorization. Perhaps it is that other humans, desert dwellers who know these wastes and recognize the signs of someone in fatal distress, find him and provide food and water. Perhaps it is that his body, having proven whatever needed proving, finally receives permission from his will to begin the process of recovery, accepting the wild plants and water sources he has been denying himself. Perhaps both explanations are true, the physical and the metaphysical so intertwined in such extreme states that separating them is impossible and ultimately pointless. What is certain is that Jesus does not die in the wilderness, though he comes terrifyingly close, and that when he eventually emerges, gaunt, weathered, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body has been pushed beyond normal limits, he is fundamentally changed. The 40 days have burned away something inessential, have clarified commitments through the brutal simplicity of survival at its most reduced. He has learned what he can endure, has discovered that the human will, properly directed, can override biological imperatives that seem absolute, and has established the terms on which his mission will proceed, not through supernatural shortcuts or political power or demonstrations that eliminate the need for faith, but through a harder path that respects human freedom and divine mystery, even when easier options exist. The wilderness behind him remains as it was, indifferent to his struggle, its rocks and wind and cold nights unchanged by his presence. The Judean desert will continue to challenge and kill those unprepared for its harshness, will offer its brutal education to seekers and fugitives and wanderers for centuries to come. But Jesus carries with him now an intimate knowledge of that place, has added his experience to the long history of prophets and holy men who sought truth in desolation, who believed that some wisdom only comes through deprivation, that the voice of God or conscience or deepest self can only be heard when all other noise is stripped away. The temptations he faced to use power for comfort, to demand certainty instead of living with faith, to pursue good ends through corrupt means, will recur throughout his life in different forms, the same essential questions asked in new contexts. But the wilderness has provided answers, not in the sense of eliminating struggle, but in establishing commitments that will shape every subsequent decision. He knows now in his body, not just his mind, what he can sacrifice and what he cannot, what he will do and what he will refuse no matter the cost. The 40 days were not wasted suffering, but forging, the kind of education that only extremity provides, where theories face testing and rhetoric confronts reality, and a man discovers what he actually believes when everything else is taken away. As he walks toward the inhabited lands, his steps slow but steady, Jesus embodies a paradox of weakness and strength, physically depleted almost to death, yet spiritually fortified by exactly that depletion, proven vulnerable, yet made resolute through that very vulnerability. The wilderness has taught him that survival is not always the highest good, that there are things worth suffering for and commitments worth maintaining even when breaking them would provide immediate relief. He has stared into the face of temptation, dressed in reasonable arguments and seductive logic, and has chosen the harder path, not because it was easier, but because it was truer to the mission taking shape within him. The devil, whether understood as external malevolent intelligence, as the personification of internal doubt and desire, or as some combination of both, has been faced and resisted, though not destroyed or eliminated. The presence will return at other times of vulnerability, will offer other bargains and suggest other shortcuts, because temptation is not a single battle, but a recurring feature of any life lived with intentionality and purpose. But the wilderness has been the decisive confrontation, the establishing of patterns and commitments that will hold through future trials. Jesus has learned that he can be hungry and not take bread, can face uncertainty and not demand proof, can see power and refuse it, and that, in these refusals lies a different kind of strength than the world typically recognizes or rewards. The frozen nights and brutal days, the thirst that made thought difficult and the hunger that made each movement an effort of will, the voice offering relief and the terrible solitude that amplified every doubt, all of it has served a purpose, has functioned as crucible for transformation. The man who emerges from the wilderness is not unchanged, but rather has become more fully himself, has shed illusions and easy certainties and discovered what remains when everything comfortable and familiar is stripped away. He carries in his wasted frame and scarred feet and wind-burned face the evidence of his ordeal, the physical cost of spiritual education, the marks of survival not just against natural hardship, but against the more dangerous threats that wear the mask of wisdom and speak with the voice of reason while leading toward dissolution and compromise. The story of these 40 days will be told and retold, interpreted and reinterpreted, becoming a template for understanding spiritual struggle and the nature of temptation. But its core remains rooted in the brutal physicality of survival. The cold that threatens hypothermia, the thirst that produces hallucinations, the hunger that consumes muscle and organ tissue, the isolation that forces confrontation with everything usually drowned out by human company and routine distraction. Jesus has lived through something that exists at the intersection of physical ordeal and spiritual warfare, has survived the wilderness, both in its geographical reality and its metaphorical dimensions, and has demonstrated that the human person, properly committed and sufficiently resolute, can endure conditions that seem designed to break body and soul simultaneously. He returns to the world of people and politics and everyday concerns, carrying knowledge purchased at terrible cost, wisdom earned through deprivation, and commitments forged in the frozen solitude of a wilderness that offered nothing but questions, and the space in which to answer them honestly, regardless of the cost.